I haven't been around since quite the very beginning, but pretty early on when the conference only drew about 350 people or so. And so it's so exciting that so many are joining us. I see we're at 101 participants, and we may be expecting double that as people find their way into the breakout rooms. So grateful for technology, and also a little sad about the limitations of technology, as I would much rather be with you in person. I live literally maybe, I'm not sure what it is in Imperial, but maybe 300 meters from the US, and haven't been able to cross into your country. So COVID is taking its toll. Nonetheless, here we are at conference, and I hear such great things about things that have already happened. I do have 3 dogs and a cat, and they are all quite upset with me about being stuck in various rooms in the house. So you may hear a little background noise. I'm hoping that sort of fades out and isn't annoying to you, and I'll try not to let it be annoying to me. So this particular breakout is about sexual ethics and how we form them, both as individuals and as communities. And I've done it at the QCF conference for several years now. I'm guessing there may be some repeat participants, because I think all of us need refreshers and reminders about how to shape this part of our life, especially when this is an area in which we've been wounded, often in religious institutions. And my hope today is that we will have a sense of hope and vitality and real affirmation and validation of our own dignity and our own sexual selves as we navigate this part of our life. So welcome, everyone. I am a bit of a technology anxiety person, so I'm going to do my best with all the multitasking and buttons and levers and get us through our presentation today. Please feel free to put any questions into the chat along the way. Between Christopher and I, we'll do our best for me to see them and find a way to incorporate them, or take some time at the end. So again, thanks for your attention. Okay, now it's not letting me advance my slides. There we go. So I want to begin with a very holistic definition of sexuality. It's one of my favorite, although there are many ways to define our sexuality. I tend to look at it as our drive to overcome our aloneness. And the reason I like this definition is that it isn't only about our physicality, as important as that is. It isn't only about what we do with our bodies, but it takes into account the emotional, spiritual, relational side of how we express ourselves in our longing to not be alone, to not be isolated. And many of us, I'm sure, in this time of COVID are feeling that drive to be quite frustrated. And so again, let's consider what choices we can make as we think about this holistic sense of sexuality. So sexual ethics then, I'm just going to pull this up. Here we go. Is the way we understand and evaluate our decisions and behavior in interpersonal relationships and sexual activity. So it's the way we understand what we want to do and how we act, and to evaluate that so that we can live consistently with what we've said we want to be and do. So it's a way of being, but there's flex, there's room for us to keep on evolving in our understanding of our sexual ethics and the way we apply them to our lives. And that, of course, is where community comes in, that we don't do this in a vacuum. We don't try to understand and evaluate our decisions and behaviors just by ourselves. Those of us who find connection in faith community have the opportunity to do this together. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Generous Space community. I serve as the executive director and have done so since 2002, because that is primarily where this presentation arises from, the communal learning that we do together. And so a lot like QCF, Generous space is primarily LGBTQ2S plus folks. We of course have straight allies who are part of our broader community. But among those LGBT folks, we have high levels of religious trauma. And this, of course, impacts the way we think about sexual ethics and the way we have conversations together. Within our community, as I know there is also in the QCF community, we have survivors of conversion therapy, and they bring a narrative that must be heard and validated as we think about and understand sexual ethics. And in our generous space community, there is a great deal of diversity in terms of where people are in their faith journey. Some are deconstructing, some are reconstructing, some are unsure, some are holding to a very similar faith paradigm as what they grew up with, and people are sort of all over the map on that. That means that people are processing and landing in different places regarding their sexual ethics, whether that be a side B commitment to remain sexually abstinent, or whether that be those who are engaged in polyamorous relationships and seeking to develop good ethics that shape and form their decisions and their behavior in that context. That's a very wide spectrum. And one of the ways we're able to come to the same table and have this conversation together is this deep commitment that we are beloved and we belong. I am beloved, I belong. No matter what my sexual ethics are, no matter how I've been hurt or traumatized, no matter what energizes the decisions and the behaviors that I participate in, I am beloved. That's non-negotiable. Nothing can change that. And I belong with others. In our generous space community, we belong together in this journey. And that conviction helps us to make room at the table even when we differ significantly. So there's a few things that I have become convinced of as I've been learning alongside our generous space community. The first is we all need to be in the conversation. Even those on the farthest ends of this spectrum of where people are landing can learn from each other, benefit from one another, and heal in hearing how different people are forming and shaping their evaluation and their decisions in this regard. In our community, we talk about non-dualistic thinking a great deal. That is the both and, not the either or, but how we hold things in tension. And so here's a series of both and statements that are really crucial in our conversation about sexual ethics. The first is that we honor both individual agency, that is an individual's right to make choices and have the resources they need to walk out those choices, and mutual accountability. We don't see those as contradictory, even though we kind of hold them in tension. Both are needed for us to thrive and flourish. We emphasize both freedom and protection. Again, it's not one or the other, but how do we hold these together for each individual and for us as a community? We want to make space for shared values where people might have very similar values that guide their understanding and their decisions, but also make space for diverse applications. So let me give you an example. If, for instance, fidelity, keeping the commitments I make, is a value, someone who is single and sexually abstinent might apply that in a very different way than someone who is in a monogamous relationship or someone who's in committed polyamorous relationships. And so we see that We can share the same value, but sometimes we will interpret it or apply it in a variety of ways, but we can still come to the same table and have conversation together and learn from each other. In our conversations communally, we want to find the common ground that brings us a sense of unity. What things can we agree on? What are some of the base commitments that we hold true? And certainly in our generous space community, that is, I'm beloved, I belong, non-negotiable. But there's a lot of other things that are common ground. And as we have conversation together, we get to tease that out and explore that. But we don't try to foster sort of a false unity where there isn't any room for disagreement. There's lots of disagreement as people are traveling their journeys in a variety of ways. And so we hold that intention that we are looking for common ground, and we want to make space for disagreement, not as a problem to fix, but that our disagreements are actually an opportunity for us to grow together, to be stretched, to mature, to be enlarged in our capacity to extend grace to one another. In our conversations, we want to empower folks to flourish. Bottom line, whatever values, whatever choices, whatever behavior you participate in, the larger community is hopeful that those things will cause you to flourish, to be blessed, to grow, to have joy, to experience fullness of life, or as Jesus said, abundant life. We want to, as a community, prioritize trust over control. Now, as we unpack centered set ethics, you'll notice that control is a feature of a bounded set way of ethics, and it's probably what most of us grew up with, that there were external controls trying to tell us and pressure us to conformity of a certain way of navigating our sexual lives. We actually want to say, you know what? I trust you. I trust that you want to flourish. I trust that you're making choices within your particular context at this point in your life that are your best effort, your best foot forward to live a life of value, dignity, and thriving. So sometimes that's more challenging to live out than it seems. That sounds so easy to say trust instead of control. As a mother of young adults, I can say not always easy as it seems. And then we want our discernment to be energized by that secure belief in our belovedness rather than shame or fear. Now, if I was with you in person, I would take a deep breath, I would look out into your faces, and I would check in and say, how we doing? That's a little bit hard when there's 116 people and I can't see any of you. But I hope you're tracking and that you'll be able to return to these slides if there's things you want to sort of chew on a little bit more. So now let's break down this idea of centered set and bounded set. Most of us, if we grew up in the Christian church, probably grew up with a bounded set regarding sexuality. And that would be a set of rules and regulations, often tied to scriptural interpretation. And those rules and regulations determined who was in and who was out. And it created an us versus them, the pure, the impure, the holy, the not holy, the accepted, the unacceptable, those who conformed and those who transgressed. And again, if we were in person, I'd probably see some heads nodding at the familiarity of that. But this is a visual picture that I didn't take, but it's a representation of a bounded set. And these 4 goats that are in this particular picture are behind a fence. I don't know if we have any visually impaired folks, but just to ensure that I'm describing that for accessibility, there's 4 goats, they're stuck behind a fence and their heads are poking through the fence rails. And it's almost like they're longing for what they assume is greener grass on the other side of the fence. But the fence is what is keeping them in the place that the external authority expects and wants them to be, in this case, the farmer. So this idea that fences are required to control the masses, to keep them in line with what we expect of them. Another visual representation here we have, and I did not create this graphic, so even in the colors, we almost see a sense of who's within a round circle, and then who's on the outside. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the inner circle is completely heteronormative. You're either single or you're partnered to an opposite sex spouse. And then on the outside, you'll see a variety of relational arrangements. In this particular graphic, there isn't a poly representation, but there could be. And that would be in most typical evangelical environments, who's in and who's out. Now in the centered set, we experience something quite different. And in this picture, there's a zebra and a lion that are both drinking side by side. Now, typically, lions would view zebras as prey, and zebras would be quite frightened of the lion and would stay away. But this visual suggests that there's an actual greater need than that typical hunter-prey relationship, and that is the nourishment and nurturing of water. That water is a greater priority than that typical enmity. And so this idea of centered set is like a rancher who has a large area of land, multiple kinds of livestock, and trusts that the center watering hole will keep their livestock sort of together, connected to the ranch. There isn't as much of a need for fences, but eventually that draw to a central source of nourishment is enough for all to be in a symbiotic relationship where they can thrive and flourish. So hopefully that makes sense. This particular graphic has a cross in the center, so a faith expression, faith in Christ as central. And you'll see, again, different representations of relationships with arrows in a variety of ways. Some arrows are pointing towards the cross, some are away, some are not quite sure where they are. And again, it's this trust over control, that people are on a journey, and that if our faith is life-giving, as many of us proclaim it to be, then people will find their way to that source, and that source will be life and flourishing and shalom. So how can we think about sexual ethics in a way that doesn't rely on rules and regulations only or fences, but actually trusts people's autonomy to clarify their values, those things that will guide their understanding, their decisions, and their behavior? So as we move towards a centered set understanding, we want to live in alignment with values that help us to discern and make decisions. So what might some of those values be? Well, when sin management, and that's a term that Richard Rohr likes to use, and I know he's speaking tonight to us, am I just a little bit excited about that? When sin management is the primary focus of our discipleship, then individualism, hiding, masks, personas, double lives, secrets, lies, fear as motivation, and shame as control become pervasive. So what's the alternative? If we're not going to be focused on sin management, what do we focus on? Instead of emphasizing our brokenness, can we emphasize our belovedness? Instead of being haunted by shame, can we be motivated by our sense of dignity and worth? Henry Nouwen, someone who did not fit the sexual majority and lived his life, unfortunately, deeply closeted, said this: fear-filled questions will never lead to love-filled answers. If we start out trying to find our way to understand and make decisions about our drive to overcome our aloneness from a place of fear that God will be mad at us, or that the church will reject us, or that our family will be ashamed of us, we will never arrive at love-filled solutions. But if we start at a place that says, I am so deeply and profoundly and fully loved that nothing and no one, nothing I do, nothing I decide, nothing can shake that or change that or mar that or tarnish that, then we can arrive at a very love-filled spaciousness in which we can make decisions that will help us to flourish. So this slide is teeny tiny print. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the devices you're using, but again, these slides were uploaded to Whova, and you can feel free to return to them. But I've clustered this notion of values into 5 different arenas, and hopefully that will, it's not comprehensive, it's not the be all end all of how to understand this, but hopefully it's a way that will bring a little bit of order as we think through what values are important to us as we navigate our sexual lives. So the first arena is dignity. And so here we want to look at how do we honor ourselves and those with whom we are in some level of relationship, either involved with sexually or involved with just as part of our drive to overcome our aloneness. Do we honor ourselves and others as beloved image bearers of God? And what values reflect the desire to uphold our own and others' dignity? And in a moment, I'll provide you with some examples to get your own thoughts going. But that's kind of the first area, dignity. Are we making decisions and behaving sexually in a manner that prioritizes our own and the other's dignity? Next. Fidelity, keeping our commitments. What does faithfulness look like? What does it look like to us? What does it look like to our partner or those we're involved with? What values help us to live into this particular arena that we want to prioritize? And third, mutuality, experiencing connection in which power is equitable, shared, not one above the other, not one lording it over or controlling the other. And so what values expand our understanding and application of mutuality? Next area, safety, feeling protected, cared for, and respected. What values will guide our expectations of safety and the safety we want to offer to those we're engaged with? And then finally, saving the best for last, pleasure, experiencing in our embodiedness, our fleshiness, joy and delight. What values will enlarge our self-awareness and attunement to our own embodied reality? Now, I'll tell you a little secret. When I began to work with this framework and put these 5 clusters together, it was very clear that pleasure was very low on my list. And that was a direct result of the way I'd been raised, the way I'd been shaped in Christian churches, in Christian schools, in a very conservative family. And in one of our sexual ethics conversations within the generous space community, one of my dear brothers in Christ said, well, I value juiciness in my sexual ethics. And it took me back, not because I was offended or shocked or anything else. I just was so curious about why that would be someone's priority and what that could be like. And it created this whole arena of learning for me and exploring the ways that I had been harmed by the context that had shaped so much of my understanding about sexuality. And so, again, I share this example to reinforce that we need to have the autonomy individually to figure out where we're at and what's important to us. But sometimes we need others in community who are in a different place than we are to spur our curiosity, to spark a wondering in us why something resonates or doesn't resonate. And that's a way that we can enlarge and expand our possibilities for flourishing. So we're going to do one more slide, and then I'm going to have Christopher do the poll. So not just yet, but let's look at some quick examples of values in these 5 different areas. So in the arena of dignity, some of the values might be things like respect or honor or affirmation. That one of the things we do, if you were again in the same room as I was, we would have a whiteboard or chalkboard, and we would just be shouting out values. Brene Brown talks about how limited our language is, and when our language is limited, our imagination is limited. But when we can hear how other people articulate these values that shape how we understand and discern things, we can become enlarged as well. So what might be some other words that you would use, some values that are really important to you in this arena of dignity? Give some thought to that. Infidelity, values like trust, communication, patience. In the arena of mutuality, values like generosity, humility, sharing. In the arena of safety, consent, honesty, protecting or being protective. And in the arena of pleasure, being fully present, presence, fun, playful, sensuality. I gave that one extra value in case you're like me and need a little help in that regard. So Christopher, can you pull up the poll for us so we can have a little bit of engagement on just how we're thinking through and perhaps prioritizing some of these values? You're muted, Christopher.
Thank you. And then for the Q&A, maybe later as we're polling, I wanted to give you this question and then maybe you could think about it and answer it later. Someone asked, what's the best way to invite people used to only the bounded sets into the scary freedom of centered sets? And I guess a follow-up question is maybe, is there a story that you could think of, you could confidentially share a very personal story of someone that you know that journeyed through this into freedom? Because that might be a really neat way for people to understand how this becomes really real. But perhaps that was already on your agenda. So we could hop into the poll if that's best right now.
Oh, yeah, let's hop in the poll first.
Okay, here we go. Hopefully everyone can see it.
All righty, we have almost everyone's voted, about 90%. And we have a pretty even spread. Safety is the greatest priority of this group, with 29% saying that would be their number one area of value that they would prioritize at this point in their life. Dignity and fidelity and mutuality are all 20, 22, 21. They're all very close together. And then maybe y'all have a similar upbringing to me. Pleasure's coming in at 8%. So this was just sort of a fun exercise to see how we're processing some of these arenas and what really matters. And certainly in a time of COVID, it's not such a big surprise that safety would come first. Although remembering that safety is bigger than just our physical safety, but a safety in the relationship, a safety to be our authentic self, a safety that we're not going to be wounded and rejected, etc. So thank you all for your participation in that poll. Returning to Christopher's question, whoever it was that brought it forward, one of the things that I find as I offer this framework in a variety of contexts, a lot of church contexts, a lot of LGBT Christian conference type contexts, is that on one hand, it isn't rocket science. I'm not presenting anything that's so astounding. I think what's interesting about this work is that it's a framework, it's language, it's some structure to understand a freer way of navigating our sexual lives. And so I regularly hear from people who just sort of say, thank you, oh my goodness, I didn't want to kind of just say anything goes and it doesn't matter, but I was being harmed by this bounded set of rules and regulations that are, for one thing, so often heteronormative. And how do I do this? So really, it's just a way of saying, this is how you do it. And for some people, it will be threatening. It will be too far of a departure from what they experienced in a bounded set. But a lot of people, including those who are in long-term monogamous relationships, say, oh, this just gives me language. Like I can talk to my partner about how we do or don't value pleasure, for instance, and what parts of pleasure, what actual values do we hold? Because maybe one partner holds adventure as a great value within the pleasure realm, but another partner says like that just doesn't feel safe, and so that feels almost at tension with or in contradiction to my great need for safety. So how can we have conversation about this and come to a shared priority, a shared commitment of how we're going to hear each other's needs and wants and values and discern together how to go forward? So I see that regularly with LGBT people. But when I hear a question like that, part of me wonders if maybe the questioner is saying, like, how can I get my conservative parents to understand this way of sexual ethics? And I will say that this manner of thinking about sexual ethics is not only for LGBTQ audiences, that even among sort of your vanilla heteronormative contexts, people also can find it quite freeing. So I think the biggest determinant in whether or not people can embrace some of this understanding, quite honestly, is their level of fear. And so one of the things I talk about often in this presentation is the spiritual practices that we need to cultivate to enable us to keep living into the flourishing that can come with centered sexual ethics. And one of those is simply this. I imagine that I have a Staples easy button, you know, that red button that says easy and you punch it and whatever you needed happens. Only my red button says pause. And it's by my side. And when I feel that, am I making the right decision? Is God going to be upset with me? You know, those kinds of fears, when I feel that coming up, I have practiced hitting that pause button and asking the very same question that Henry Nouwen asked. How would this be different if I was energized by love and not by fear? How would I approach this question, this decision, this opportunity if I was really solid in my own belovedness, the unshakableness of my belovedness, rather than these old whispering accusations or messages of shame or messages of fear. And quite honestly, I think our parents, our pastors, others in our lives who would want to sort of push us back towards a bounded set, which feels safer to them, especially when they're worried about your salvation. I think we gently need to invite them as well to say, if you were confident in God's love for me, for you, that nothing can separate us from the love of God that is ours in Christ Jesus, how might you think about these questions differently? But having said that, there's no guarantee. I can lay out this framework and some people will receive it gladly and some people will reject it and potentially scapegoat me as a heretic. But I think as I continue to work with communities, individuals, groups, we see that a good tree bears good fruit. We see the good fruit of people having a framework in which to make wise decisions. So in this final portion of the presentation, and then I will have some time for questions at the end, so feel free to put more questions into the chat room. These are some questions that I hope will actualize how to apply this framework in your life. Okay, so let's go through these and then we'll have some time for Q&R together. So let's see if my little switch is coming up.
And for those of you in Wahooba, if you will utilize the chat function, I will try to transfer those over. I know a lot of folks in Wahooba may not have had functionality to some of the Q&A and poll stuff. So say it in the chat and just know that there'll probably be 3 times more questions than what we can answer. So we might have to condense it. So
I'll whip through this part really quickly so we have as much time at the end as possible. So the invitation is that the expression of our sexuality is life-giving in our relationship with 3 parts: God, ourselves, and others. And so what might be some questions that could animate that? The first is, in the beliefs, values, and practices that you are developing regarding your sexuality, is your relationship with God flourishing? So you're using Grindr, you're making decisions about that. Do you feel like that's contributing to your relationship with God in a way that's flourishing? And I'm not saying yay or nay, because I don't know your context. I don't know the ways that you might be using proximity apps as part of your drive to overcome your aloneness. But these are simply some questions to take stock and to be curious with yourself in a gentle and kind, not shaming way, to say, what's going on with the beliefs, the practices, the decisions I'm currently making? Next, is your life open to God without hiddenness or shame? Now, there's always a little bit of irony in this question because God knows everything about us, but do we feel like we're living a somewhat compartmentalized life? That the worship session at QCF conference is one area where we're alive and flourishing, and then kind of our sexual life is another area where we feel alive, but there's separation, or is that well integrated? Something to ask yourself. Are you flourishing in your acceptance of yourself? Do you love yourself more? Are you able to affirm yourself? Do you feel good about the choices you're making? Do you feel like you are more and more able to be your true self? Not personas, not keeping up an image, but letting go of those self-protective walls. Not that we don't protect ourselves, but those walls that keep people out, keep people from seeing our true authenticity. Are you able to experience the healing, the rest, and the confidence of being the beloved of God in the midst of the decisions and behaviors you're participating in? Are your relationships with others flourishing? Or do you find that your relationships right now are troublesome to you, not giving you life, but stressing you out or causing you pain? Are you dignifying those around you? Do people feel more themselves around you? Do they feel like they're blessed, they're seen? Do you find yourself growing in your capacity for self-emptying love for others? Now, self-emptying doesn't mean that you don't matter, but it's being able to give with a generosity and an abandon that doesn't worry whether there'll be enough for you. Maybe that's another seminar where we could unpack that more. Are you growing in giving and receiving trust? Those of us who've been traumatized, those of us who've been hurt in our family of origin, in our churches, in relationships, that can be a huge area, but also a huge marker to say, am I growing, or am I taking steps backward in being able to trust? If we find we're going backwards, maybe we need to relook at our values and say, what are our priorities? And how can that affect our decisions so that we can continue to heal and grow in our capacity for trust? Next invitation, that the expression of our sexuality reflects that we are image bearers of God, creator of the universe, fount of all love. So here are some questions. Are we honoring of those we are in intimate relationship with? Do we long to see the other grow, fulfill their calling, be unimpeded in partnering with God? Are we vulnerable, honest, and deeply connected to the other? Are we attuned to the way power is shared, given, received, relinquished, and embodied in our relationships? Invitation, that the expression of our sexuality is marked by fidelity, that we keep our commitments. So the question is, do we keep our commitments? As short-term or long-term or involved or complex or simple as they may be. Do we persevere, pursue reconciliation and restoration? Sometimes relationships end, and sometimes we are hurt, sometimes we hurt others. But have we really invested in trying to pursue reconciliation and restoration where we can, as far as it depends upon us? Do the ones we love feel safe and secure in their relationship with us? And if you don't know, maybe you need to ask your partner, do they feel that? Do we embrace fidelity as a gift that humanizes us? When we've experienced shame in our understanding of sexuality, this question around fidelity can feel sometimes like a club. And so if we feel that way, then this is a question to ponder. And you can feel free to email me if you need to understand this question a little bit more. I'll put my email up at the very end. But this capacity to keep our commitments, it contributes to our sense of our dignity and value as human beings. And do we recognize how the fidelity in our relationship or relationships impacts the broader community? And again, if you want to chat a bit more about what that question even means, feel free to contact me. So that's my contact information. I'm going to open up the chat. We have about 15 minutes left, I believe, Christopher. And
yes, that is correct. And I will put this information on contact also in chats.
Sure.
Wendy, are you able to see the questions?
Well, I know there's 55
there's
to the chat. So I'm just trying to figure out the best way to go about this, but maybe I'll just read the first question I see.
Okay, and I could send some to you in individual chat if it's not so overwhelming. So
yeah, if you want to pick out a few, I'll start with this one from Brendan. Taking internalized homophobia and intense sexual shame in participating in purity culture into account, how do we separate those past and current traumas from our current actions to know what a healthy sexual ethic is for me as an individual? I don't know that trying to separate things is always the best way. I think our traumas are part of who we are, and they inform how we prioritize the values that we want to hold on to. And so I think understanding from the ways you've been hurt what is important to you is actually a starting point to look at listing out those values that really matter. And so if you've experienced a lot of shame, then that cluster related to dignity may become one of your priority areas at this stage in your journey. So you want to be with a partner in relationships in which there's just a lot of beautiful affirmation of your belovedness, of your dignity, of your value, of your worth, that it's a relational context in which you feel seen and known, and you're reminded that you're safe, that you're secure, that you're protected. So I think trying to separate those things will actually bite us in the butt later, if that makes sense. I think we need to kind of bring all of that into our present and say, what do I need? This is part of my journey, part of my reality. I wouldn't have chosen it. I might still be really grieving that this was part of my journey, but how does it shape what I need right now to flourish? So hopefully that's a bit of a beginning of a response.
okay, here is the next one that's going to come.
Is there a biblical basis for marriage? Is this the one I'm looking at?
Yes. Big question, right?
Yeah. What did marriage mean in the Bible then? I get shamed so much for thinking outside of this frame. It's like people won't consider another framework, which is the basis of this question. Walter Wink, who has passed away, but was one of the early scholars who had any hearing in the evangelical community to talk about ethics around same-sex sexuality. And this was like way back. I want to say late 70s, early 80s that he was writing. And Walter Wink said, you know, the Bible doesn't have a sexual ethic. The Bible only has a love ethic. And I think that's really interesting because we see all sorts of different sexual arrangements, relationships, laws that are bizarre and confusing to many of us today. The idea that a woman has to marry her rapist, you know, the idea that a brother needs to marry his former sister-in-law to produce an heir for his dead brother. I mean, there are all sorts of descriptions of sexual arrangements that just don't make any sense to us today. And so what is this love ethic? What is that about? How do we see a love ethic through the teaching and life of Jesus and the incarnation and the Trinity in a way that we understand marriage and covenant to be about a mutual commitment for self-emptying love that may, you know, enlarge and become a family unit. So the a big point about centered set sexual ethics is not to tell people what they ought to believe and what they ought to do, but to give them tools to, if they're a believer, to prayerfully discern what will shape their decisions now. For some people, that will mean a waiting until marriage kind of sexual ethic. For others, that might look very different. I think the key question is to say, how do I bring both my hurts and my longing to flourish together before God, understanding what I most value, and begin to have the courage to step out in love, to say, I'm going to experience this as an expression of these values. Now, this might be simply expressing love and nurture and care for someone of the same sex. If that's a first step, it could look very different than that. But I think one of the things you want to take into account is your own readiness. That this framework is not about pushing you to a radically different place than what you were formed and shaped by as you were growing up, but it is simply an invitation to take stock, to maybe interrogate your assumptions a little bit, to question a sort of a steadfast rule and regulation that doesn't seem to even take into account LGBTQ2S plus folks, and be curious about how some other values might give you a little bit more breathing space in a way that actually applies to you. So hopefully that's a bit helpful. So there's a question that says, lots of gay men who are in open relationships, not poly, but open sexually. Does that, or how does that fall into the realm of fidelity? Again, centered set sexual ethics are not making moral judgments on anyone's decision. That might be, so if someone's in a pastoral relationship with me and they've let me know what their values are and how they choose and commit to live in alignment with those, then accountability will be, so how's that working out? Are the decisions you're making in line with those values? The framework itself hopefully can be applied in a variety of contexts. So if someone at this stage in their journey says, I've had enough with the shame and the trauma, and I need a way to come out from under the thumb of that, and I think the way to do that is open relationships, then fidelity asks a question, do you keep your commitments? So what commitments are you making in that context, and to whom, and are you keeping them? So I think there is a way to consider fidelity regardless of how you're living out your sexuality. And that's simply, do I keep my commitments? If I have broken commitments, what am I doing to bring restoration, to acknowledge, to take ownership, to apologize, to make restitution if I can, to restore trust? That's the substance of fidelity, and it can be applied in a variety of ways. It could be a commitment for an individual. It could be a commitment they make for that night or that day or that encounter. And maybe part of that commitment is respect, is safety, is honest disclosure, is commitment to consent. All of that is caught up in the notion of fidelity. Hopefully that makes sense.
Wendy, we are just about time. So I have time for maybe a closing remarks for 60 or 90 seconds, and then we will say farewell.
You know, I was married for 25 years, and was a virgin when I got married, and I've only ever had one sexual partner in my life. I'm as vanilla as they come when it comes to sexuality. So sometimes people think I'm this like raging libertarian or, don't care about sexual ethics. What I care about is people coming out from under the damage and the power of shame and control so that they can flourish and actually, in that flourishing, make choices that are life-giving. And I think this framework has the flexibility for diversity that takes into account the context of people's real lives. And I am a firm believer that the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, when Jesus said, "It is finished," that the power of sin and death were broken. I don't think there's anything that we do in the realm of our sexual lives that can separate us from the love of God. So I would less use fear of sin as a deterrent and more say, if we're making choices that are impeding our growth and our value and our dignity and our capacity to love, then how can we receive the gift of freedom and salvation and forgiveness to make choices that will enlarge our experience of life? And if we can do that, I think God smiles. So my final comment is, remember, no matter what, you are beloved and you belong, and nobody and no one, no rule, nothing can take that away from you. Thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of conference.